In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make these filet crochet shorts. They could also be a skirt as well, you just don't split them into shorts. And I've included in the tutorial how you could do like a little split at the back of the skirt as well if you wanted to do the skirt method. But I made them into shorts because I love wearing a pair of crochet shorts. I love filet crochet, so I thought why not combine them together. So they have an elastic waistband and I doubled up the yarn around the waist just to give it a bit of a thicker look, but you can totally adapt this tutorial to be however you want it to be. Also, I did the design just on one leg, but you could do it on both. I have a bit more information on that in the ebook version, which you'll also need for the actual grids themselves. So yeah, you can follow along with this tutorial for the method and how to make these shorts, and the grids are all in the ebook. I also made this matching bralette, but it's a separate tutorial just to keep them separate in case you want to make one and not the other, and also to avoid this video being too long. For these shorts, I used 4 balls of rainbow lace yarn from Hobbii in this royal blue colour. It's just a lace weight cotton yarn. I didn't actually finish the last ball of yarn, so you could probably get away with 3 and a bit balls, but it really depends on your size anyway. So I'm around a size medium, and this is how many I needed, but you may want more or less anyway. I used a 2mm crochet hook, and you'll also need some elastic and some thread to sew this elastic closed into a circle. This elastic should be the length of your waist or wherever you want the shorts to sit. I would give the elastic a slight stretch as you measure it around yourself, as you want this to cinch in the waist, but you also don't want it to be too tight. So before we get into it, I'll just explain a filet crochet grid, which is made up of blank and filled in squares to make your design. So I've got this little section of a grid pattern, and I'm going to talk you through it right to left, just so you can fully understand what each grid square means. So for this section, it's a double crochet chain, 11 more double crochets, chain, and a double crochet. It's just important to remember that every square on the grid counts for 2 stitches. This is sometimes a double crochet and a chain for a blank square, and other times it's 2 double crochets for a filled in square. But you also have to remember that grid squares share walls with each other. So for the section of 5 filled in squares here, the total number of double crochets is 11 because of this shared stitch. It's also worth noting some people decide to do 2 double crochets to fill in each filled square. This just follows the same principles as I've already outlined, but just doubled in number. So also for the blank squares, you'd want to do 2 chains instead of 1 chain in between. This is also a very simple and effective way of adding width to a grid pattern without needing to alter the actual pattern itself. One more thing before we get into the making of these shorts: whenever you run out of a ball of yarn and need to change onto a new one, we're going to do so with a magic knot. So to do a magic knot, you take your 2 ends of yarn, with one of the pieces of yarn tie a knot around the other piece of yarn, and now do the same with the other piece of yarn, so tie a knot with this one around your first piece of yarn. You'll now have 2 knots that you can pull together securely. You can either trim the ends or leave them long enough to weave in. We're going to start by making the waistband. I actually doubled up my yarn to make the waistband a little bit thicker, but this is totally optional, you don't have to do it. With the doubled up yarn, I actually used a 3mm hook instead of the 2mm hook, which I used for the rest of the shorts. My starting chain was 21 chains long, as I wanted my rib stitch to be 20 stitches wide with 1 turning chain. I like to check that the length of my chain is at least double the width of the elastic, because this is going to be encased inside, so it needs to be able to be doubled over. Once you have your starting chain, single crochet back down the length of it. To do a single crochet, push your hook through, pull some yarn back, yarn over, and pull through the 2 loops on your hook. When you get to the other end of the row, chain once and turn your work. This next row is going to be a little bit different to the first row, as we're going to start doing our rib stitch. For the first and last stitch of each row, I like to do a complete single crochet where I push through both sides of the stitch in the row before, but for every other stitch in the row, we need to work into the back loop only. So we're still doing a single crochet stitch, but only into the back loop to give the ribbed look. When you reach the last stitch of the row, do a normal complete single crochet and then chain once to turn your work. On your way back down the row, do a normal single crochet into the first stitch and then do your single crochet rib stitch the rest of the way down the row until you reach the last stitch, where again you'll be doing a complete single crochet before chaining and turning your work. Now you just repeat this process row after row to give you the ribbed look for the waistband. Crochet your waistband to be long enough to stretch around the largest part of your lower body so that you can pull the shorts up and over this part. Do not crochet the waistband to be the exact size of your waist unless this is the largest part of your lower body, as you won't actually be able to get them up. So I can't stress this enough. If you think the shorts may be on the tighter side, just make the waistband a bit bigger. You can always tighten the elastic to pull them tighter, but you need them to be big enough for the rest of the shorts to work. Once your waistband is long enough, we need to slip stitch the first row to the last row. To slip stitch your first row to the last row, complete your final row of stitching, chain once and then match your first and last row up together. Then push the hook through the stitch on one side and then through the corresponding stitch on the other side. Pull some yarn back through both stitches and then through the loop on your hook. Continue this process all the way down the row. When you get to the last stitch, do not secure and cut the yarn. We're now going to insert the elastic. You need to cut and sew your elastic to your desired waist measurement. I chose to sew this together on my sewing machine, but you can stitch this together by hand. Just make sure it's really secure. Place your elastic waistband over your ribbed waistband. It is totally normal if this elastic scrunches your waistband a bit and makes it look a lot smaller than your ribbed band. Then we want to fold the ribbed waistband over the elastic to encase it. We now want to close the ribbed waistband with the elastic inside it, so your yarn is already attached to one side of your waistband where we attach the sides together. Slip stitch into the other side of the folded ribbed waistband. We're now going to repeat this process all the way around the waistband, but instead of slip stitching, we're going to single crochet as this has a bit more stretch to it. You will want to single crochet into every end stitch of the ribbing. If you're unsure about the number of stitches to do in the round here, it may be a good idea to count how many rows of ribbing you did and match this number. Once you've single crocheted all the way around the waistband and encased the elastic inside, slip stitch from your last single crochet stitch into the first single crochet stitch. To give you an idea of stitch count, for my size I crocheted 160 stitches in the round. Chain twice, cut the yarn and pull it through to secure a knot. We're now going to start working on the main body of the shorts. So I chose to change back to one single piece of yarn and my 2mm crochet hook. At this point, I also attached stitch markers every 10 stitches to help me keep count as I worked up the first row of my shorts. This is totally optional, but I find it helpful for figuring out where to place my grid pattern on the shorts, so I would recommend doing this. I placed 2 orange stitch markers at the back seam as well, just to show where the round starts and ends. With these stitch markers in place, I then worked up my first row of the shorts. Firstly, attach your yarn back onto the project at the back seam with a slip stitch. Then there are a few different ways you can begin your shorts. The way I chose to do was to chain up 3 times, so 2 chains for the stitch height and 1 chain to act as my space between the double crochets, and then I double crocheted into the next stitch along. Usually with a double crochet mesh stitch, you would skip a stitch before doing your double crochet. However, as I doubled up my yarn for the waistband and first row of crochet, this row appears a bit thicker and wider, so I made the call to do my double crochet mesh stitch into every stitch in the row without skipping every other stitch, if that makes sense. So as you can see, I'm doing a double crochet and a chain and then double crocheting straight into the next stitch instead of skipping over a stitch. You can totally do your double crochet mesh stitch like usual and skip every other stitch, but this will also bring your stitch count down to be half the size, which will make your shorts fit a lot tighter. Remember, as I explained before, each grid square on your filet crochet pattern equals 2 stitches, so by doing your double crochet mesh stitch into every stitch on the first row, you keep your stitch count for the grid correct. As I also mentioned earlier, you may also choose to double up your filet crochet design by doing 2 chains between stitches for blank squares and filling in the filled in squares with 2 stitches each. If you choose to do this, you'll want to make sure that on this blank row you begin doing your 2 chains between your mesh stitches. I would still recommend doing your mesh stitch into every stitch for this row so that you don't bring the stitch count down too far. After completing 1 round of your mesh stitch, we're going to slip stitch from the last stitch into the first stitch to complete the round. You'll want to finish this round with a chain, so this can act as the gap between your last and first stitch. Once you've slip stitched your round together, chain up 3 times to turn the work. You will also now want to decide where your grid pattern is going to sit on your shorts and mark this out with some stitch markers. My grid is 56 columns wide and I chose to place my grid on one of the legs of the shorts. I find this easiest as it won't interfere with the splitting of the shorts into 2 legs when that time comes. So I counted 14 stitches from my back seam marker, which I've marked with 2 orange stitch markers, and I placed one of my stitch markers here, which is my green stitch marker, to signify the start of my grid. Then after 56 squares, I placed my next stitch marker to signify the end of my grid, which is also the green stitch marker. Ignore this other orange stitch marker. I removed this later as I just left it here accidentally. Then 10 stitches further along marks the halfway point of the front center of my shorts. This is the yellow stitch marker. Once you have your stitch markers placed, you can begin working up your grid pattern. Your first row will take a lot of counting as you're starting fresh, but every other row you can start to use your previous row to help you figure out where your filled in squares go. Although if it sounds complicated, just keep to counting. So for my grid, I knew I needed to do my usual double crochet mesh stitch to go from my back seam to my first stitch marker. Then to begin my pattern, my grid calls for 13 blank squares before I get to my first filled in square. So from my green stitch marker, I did 13 double crochet mesh stitches to get my 13 blank squares. Then I have 4 filled in squares, so this called for a total of 9 double crochet stitches in a row. So remember, your filled in square stitch count should always equal the number of squares times 2 plus 1, because there's always 1 stitch shared between squares. Continue following your grid to complete this row of stitching. Once you reach your other stitch marker, you should have completed that grid section of your shorts. Continue your double crochet mesh stitch all the way around the rest of your shorts until you reach the back seam, or if you've decided to do another grid on your shorts, continue this until your other grid section. Remember to always finish on a chain to act as the gap between your first and last stitch. Slip stitch from your last stitch into your first stitch, chain up 3 times and turn your work. Now double crochet mesh stitch back around to where your stitch markers are for your grid section. Again, follow the grid to create your pattern in this area of the shorts. Remember to work from the other side of the grid this time because we've turned our work. So every row, we're going to be working from opposite ends of the grid because we're turning our work every row. Continue this process for however many rows reaches the length you want the main body of your shorts to be. For me, this was 36 rows of the grid, including the first completely blank round that we did. So 35 rows of actual filet grid. Just remember, however many rows of the grid design you do, the rest will need to be accounted for in the leg pieces of the shorts. What I mean by this is that because I did 35 rows of the design as the main body of the shorts, this left me with 23 rows for the legs. If you want the legs to be shorter or longer, you may want to account for this when you divide your grid pattern into the main body and the leg sections. You can always add more complete rows of filled in squares to the bottom of the shorts for a little bit of added length, and it gives it a little bit of a border look. And just before we split this project into shorts, I just wanted to show you that you can keep it as a skirt if you would prefer. You can basically continue doing what we have been doing if you just wanted a tube skirt, but if you want a split down the back, you would basically stop attaching your last stitch and first stitch together, like no more joining in the round. You would just chain and turn and carry on working. So you'd almost just start working as a panel, if that makes sense. But I am going to show you how to split this into shorts. So once you've settled on where to split your project and you've completed your last row of the main body of your shorts, as usual, slip stitch from the last stitch into the first stitch to complete the round, and then we're going to secure the yarn. So chain once or twice. I usually chain twice for extra security, cut the yarn and pull it through to secure a knot. We're now going to reattach the yarn onto the project at the front and the back of the shorts, but we'll do this one section at a time. This bit takes a little bit of counting and tracing to work out where to attach your yarn. I wanted my gusset to be 7 blank squares wide. You can make the gusset as thin or as wide as you'd like. I found that 7 squares was a comfortable amount to lead nicely into my leg holes. Your gusset doesn't have to be the exact width of your crotch area. Mine was definitely still narrower than my crotch is. To find the middle of the back of the shorts is easy as we have our round connecting here. So however many squares you choose to make your gusset, spread these evenly each side of your back seam. So I decided to reattach my yarn to my project on the 3rd double crochet away from the back seam, with the project facing the way of the open stitches. I reattached the yarn onto this double crochet with a slip stitch. I then chained up 3 times and began my double crochet mesh stitches across. I did this to form 7 blank squares before chaining up 3 times and turning my work. Then I worked back along the row in the exact same way. Continue doing this until your gusset reaches halfway toward the other side of the shorts. You may want to try them on and pull the gusset forward to see where it's reaching, but you basically want it to meet halfway of your crotch. My gusset from the back section of my shorts measured 12 rows. This actually ended up being more than I needed and took me over halfway, so I made the gusset from the front section of my shorts shorter to compensate. Once you have finished the last row of this side of the gusset, secure your yarn by chaining, cutting the yarn and pulling it through to form a knot. I do the gusset in this way so that we can hide the seam that attaches them in the middle of the crotch. Otherwise, it would end up attaching in a more visible area. Now, we need to make the front section of the gusset. We're going to do this in the exact same way as the back gusset, but finding the center is a little harder as we don't have the back seam. But we do have our stitch markers from earlier, so I know that my yellow marker is my front middle, so I just need to trace down from here to work out where the middle front of my shorts is. Like with the back gusset, we just want to make our gusset cross the front middle point with even spacing. So I attached my yarn on the third double crochet stitch across from the middle, again with the stitches facing open. Like with the back gusset, I then did my double crochet mesh stitch to be 7 blank squares wide. Repeat each row following the same process as before. I did this for 8 rows. Once your rows are complete, we're going to keep the yarn attached so that we can slip stitch the front and back gusset together. This makes the total row count of my gusset 20 rows. To slip stitch the gussets together, first make sure your project is inside out if you have a preference, and line up your front and back gusset pieces. Then push your hook through the first stitch on one side and through the first stitch on the other side. Pull some yarn back through and then back through the loop on your hook. Continue slip stitching across this row. I chose to slip stitch every stitch and every chain together. Once you reach the end, we need to secure the yarn, chain, cut the yarn and pull it through to secure a knot. We did this with the project inside out as you end up with a little bit of a seam here, but it's really not that obvious. Now that your gusset is made, you can start making your leg holes. It's up to you which leg hole you do first. I always choose to do the leg with the design on so that we can just complete that grid. Attach your yarn back onto the project by getting a slip knot onto your hook and slip stitching into the side of one of the gusset stitches. I normally choose somewhere in the middle of the gusset section. Chain up 3 times to act as your first stitch, and you'll want to work out which way round your open stitches are on the rest of the leg here and begin crocheting toward the leg hole in the direction that you can see your open stitches. For the first row along this gusset section, we just want to do our double crochet mesh stitches into the top of each stitch at the end of every row. So we're technically crocheting into the sides of stitches here, but this is only for the first row. Do this mesh stitch until you reach the end of your gusset. You should now be able to start doing your stitches seamlessly into the body of the shorts like we have been doing this entire time. You'll want to figure out which way your filet grid is facing at this point because we've turned the shorts inside out and they've moved. So we just want to work out which way the grid is facing and continue crocheting your design following the same method we have been doing for the rest of the shorts. Continue crocheting around the body of your shorts until you reach the other end of your gusset. Now crochet into the ends of the stitches as we did at the beginning of this round. When you reach where you attached your yarn, chain once and then slip stitch from the last stitch into the first stitch. This is the same method of joining the rounds as the rest of the shorts. Now chain 3 times and turn your work to begin the next round. We're now going to continue building the leg of the shorts in this new smaller round. Do your double crochet mesh stitch around the leg hole until you reach your filet grid design. Make sure, like with the main body of the shorts, that you flip your grid at the end of each round. We're then going to repeat this process for the rest of the leg. So I did this for 23 rows. On your last row, complete your last round as usual, and then we'll need to secure the yarn. So chain, cut the yarn and pull it through to form a knot. We can now repeat the exact same process on the second leg, but it's a whole load easier because I only had my filet design on one side of the shorts. So this second leg is just 23 rounds of double crochet mesh stitch. The main thing to remember when doing this mesh stitch, and I've already said it, but I'll say it again, is that when you're finishing the round, you always want to make sure you end the round on a chain before slip stitching from the last stitch to the first stitch, as you need this gap in between the stitches. Once you've crocheted your rounds of double crochet mesh stitch to match the length of your first leg, we're going to again secure the yarn by chaining, cutting the yarn and pulling it through to form a knot. Weave in any loose ends and then they're done.